Hi, welcome to YTV and this week's segment of Everybody Has a Story. Jay Carney served as the White House press secretary under President Barack Obama for nearly 3.5 years before stepping down this past June. He now serves as a political commentator for CNN, and he joins us today. Jay, thanks for being here.
Cody, thanks for having me.
So how does it feel to be back at Yale, your alma mater?
Yeah, I really enjoy coming back, and I haven't been back often, maybe 3 times since I graduated a few too many years ago. It's been really fun. I enjoy it, especially this time of year.
Well, let's get to probably the biggest story in the past couple weeks, which was the 2014 midterms. Not a great result.
I'm trying to forget what happened.
Right. Well, it's no secret that the president was told at the beginning of his administration that he would lose a lot of political capital if he tried to push health care through as his first big piece of legislation. And he went forward with the Affordable Care Act. Do you think with what happened in the 2010 midterms and the most recent midterms, that decision was worth it?
Absolutely. It was a project 100 years in the making, something that had been taken up by presidents of both parties for a long, long time without success. And the president felt it was very important to take advantage of the moment, to take advantage of the large majorities the Democrats had in the Senate and the House at the time, to get it done. And the point wasn't to position himself or the Democrats to do well or to do less poorly in a midterm election. The point was to change the dynamic in the way that Americans were getting insured or were left uninsured in this country for the longer term economic benefit of the country and for the betterment of the health security of the people. So there's definitely a political price that's been paid here, and it may continue to be paid for a little while. But I don't think Supreme Court challenges notwithstanding, I'm pretty confident that it's here to stay, and that it's going to be harder and harder for politicians to run on repeal, because instead of an idea in theory, it's an idea in practice now, and there are millions of people who are getting health insurance because of the Affordable Care Act, who are probably going to be pretty upset if politicians say, you know what, we want to do away with it. And I know the president believes that it was the right thing to do.
Well, speaking of what politicians were running on, the general narrative of the most recent midterms and maybe even the 2010 midterms were that there were many Democrats that were running away from the president, that didn't want him to campaign in their state or in their district. How do you think the president will play a role in the 2016 election? Do you think that he'll be active, or will he play more of the role that President Bush did, which is kind of disappearing from public view?
I think we don't know yet. I think that the experience we just had in the midterms and what we've seen in past cycles is that it's pretty difficult to effectively disassociate yourself with the leader of your party if that person's president. So I'm not sure that it's understandable that Democratic candidates and incumbents kept their distance from the president, but it probably wasn't very effective. People aren't going to buy it. And I think that in the 2016 cycle, depending on how it plays out, depending on how the economy is doing, depending on what the president's numbers look like, that he's could potentially be an asset to the Democratic nominee. He's obviously an historic figure in the party and retains a lot of support among key constituencies in the Democratic Party. So I don't think you'll see in the next cycle what we saw in 2000, when I think to his own detriment, Al Gore distanced himself from Bill Clinton probably more than he should have. I mean, definitely more than he should have, especially because Clinton was at that time on the rise in terms of public approval despite all the issues in his presidency. And I think it just wasn't plausible. He had been vice president, and it probably did him harm in the end.
Well, let's shift to your role as press secretary. You did this for nearly 3.5 years. They started televising these briefings in the 90s, which has certainly led to some grandstanding and some histrionics, as you've said on CNN. Do you think they should move back?
Well, what happened is that the decision was made. Mike McCurry, one of Bill Clinton's press secretaries, agreed to the request that the entire briefing be televised on camera. prior to that, it was really just the way they did it was the first 10 minutes of the briefing. So under all previous press secretaries in the television age, they had just the top of the briefing televised, and then they turn off the cameras, and the rest of the briefing would stay on the record, but no cameras. And the idea was that TV got what it needed in the top on the news of the day, and then the cameras went off, and that definitely lowered the temperature. And what I experienced was that I could, give a briefing on the record with the full White House press corps in the briefing room that was televised, and that experience could be very, full of grandstanding, full of sort of intensity and combativeness. And then I could have a briefing completely on the record without cameras on Air Force One, and the tone and tenor was completely different. And the substance was at least as deep in the briefings on Air Force One, and the questions just as tough, but they just weren't as theatrical. So I think the problem exists, and I think that the press corps and the public are probably not particularly enlightened by the experience, but it's hard to change it now because video, images, and television is such a big part of how people consume news that to suddenly, if a press secretary, one of my successors, were to say, you know what, we're going back to just 10 minutes, there'd be just a complete revolt in the briefing room, and television would, the cables and the TV networks would claim it was censorship, and of course now where you have journalists who are online reporters, but they do video, they do the written word, and the distinctions are all blurred. So I don't think that's going to change. I think what you could see, and what I would recommend, is maybe not as frequent televised briefings. Maybe instead of every day that the president's in town, doing a televised briefing, that you kind of alternate. That's what on my way out the door, I said to my successors, why don't you try that? See how that flies.
Does the president watch the briefings ever? You come out and he gives you some tips on how it went? Or?
He doesn't watch almost any televised news, but he's a voracious consumer of news, written news. And so in the way that you can hear or see or find out about some of the things that would go down in the briefing, the president was always aware of it or would be made aware of it. And sometimes he would talk to me about an exchange or send me an email about something that he may have heard happen, but he wouldn't have seen it live. Very rarely do I think. He didn't have a TV in the Oval, but he might have been walking past his assistant's desk and the briefing might be on, so I know he saw some of it, but he wouldn't watch for long.
Well, we always end these interviews with a speed round of kind of quick, fun questions. So the first one, most ridiculous question you've had to answer as a White House press secretary? I gave a lot of briefings, so not all of them can I remember, but there was a radio reporter named Les Consolving who I would sometimes call on just for comic relief, and he would ask about the president's views on marijuana legalization back when that was not as prominent a reality as it is now. And he asked about the president's views on bestiality and things like that, and he would do it in a booming voice, and it was always good to call on him to kind of break up the momentum that was building up on another subject. Number two, how do you get your news in the morning? What's the first thing you read?
I'm kind of stuck in my old habits. I still look at the New York Times first, and I'll do this all electronically, even though the paper copy of the Times is sitting out on my outside my front door. I'll probably still just look at it on an iPad, but I'll move around between the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal, and then I'll check my Twitter feed, and I'll check Vox.com, which I think is an excellent new venture that has already, I think, delivered exceptional results in this new explanatory journalism format that I find very useful.
Now, I know that I read that your son is part of a boy band. Were you ever as cool as your son?
Not at that age. Not at that age. Now, I owe my transition from journalism to government service to the fact that I am also in a garage band, or have been for a long, long time, that in a band that never plays anymore, really. But one of my colleagues in the White House, who's still there and actually is the president's deputy national security advisor, but had worked for Joe Biden before that as national security advisor to the vice president. He and I are in a bad garage band and have been for years. So that relationship is how I ended up working for the vice president, or at least got on his radar as a possible communications director, which just goes to show that rock and roll leads to interesting places.
You have to be locked in a room for 24 hours with either Jonathan Karl of ABC News or Ed Henry of Fox. Who do you choose?
That sounds like torture. In either case, if I guess John Karl.
I didn't expect that. Okay. Number 5. I know the president has done, Reddit chat rooms, Google Hangouts, you name it. He's on Twitter. He's on Facebook. When is President Obama going to get a Snapchat?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't think. I mean, if the medium itself lends itself to the purposes that a White House is looking to pursue, because the whole idea is to try to get your message to stick, to try to saturate, to try to leave some residue. And if the purpose of Snapchat is to be there and disappear and not have a lasting impact,
but he can send some vengeful Snapchats to Ted Cruz or something.
That would be pretty fun. Maybe he's doing it already.
Number 6, guilty pleasure binge watching show.
I love Homeland. I mean, I'm not alone. I think it's a great show, and I think that there are aspects of it that, within reason, ring true about some of the conflicts that we have and some of the gray areas that we encounter when it comes to dealing with the threat of Islamic extremism. So I think it's well acted. It's a great show.
Any good pranks that you pulled on a fellow White House staffer?
I couldn't possibly talk about that.
Do you remember the TV fight song at all?
I don't. I remember that there was one, and I wouldn't sing it if I did.
Yeah, it's not appropriate for camera. I know that you will leave the Jackal to C.J. Craig, but were you ever tempted to just quote her at the podium and see if anyone noticed? Anyone noticed?
There were moments when I felt like I was living in a West Wing episode, and that's the show that I think, even though it's obviously a Hollywood version of life in the West Wing, I think it's the show that most closely approximates the real experience. But I don't think I ever went up there. I was so worried about the real issues that we were dealing with that I probably didn't have the bandwidth to then come in with a pretend set or a script that was drawn from Hollywood.
Would you rather be press secretary for President Frank Underwood or President Mitt Romney?
Romney, Romney, not my politics, but at least to my knowledge hasn't murdered anybody.
Oh, that's a spoiler.
Yeah.
People haven't watched. 2016, are you ready for Hillary?
Well, I'd say a couple things. One, it's enormously important in my view that somebody succeeds President Obama who wants to continue to move the country in the direction that he was moving it. And obviously that's going to be something that a lot of people out there disagree with. So I'm not sure who the Democratic nominee is going to be. I think the overwhelming likelihood is it will be Hillary Clinton, and I would very much like to see her then prevail. But she's got to run a good campaign, and she's got to make an argument that resonates with the American people in order to do that. And she brings an enormous amount of experience in the Senate, in the White House, and as Secretary of State to the table. But she also has to make a compelling case for why she ought to take office. It's always hard when there's been a two-term presidency for that president's party to then win a third term and a fourth potentially. So it's not, it's a challenge, but I think it's an important one.
What's next for you? I mean, you've said that you don't want to really have a long-term TV career, and you're
Right.
also not going to publish a memoir.
Uh-huh.
What comes next?
Well, I may write a book at some point, but not in the near term. And I really don't know about the stuff I'm doing on TV, where that will where that will take me. Right now I'm doing what I set out to do when I told the president back in April that it was time for me to move on, which is I'm spending more time with my kids, because you don't get your kids back at this age ever again. I had certainly, like a lot of people who have the privilege of serving in a White House, had to make some sacrifices, and my kids, my family had to deal with my absences. So that's my focus right now, but I'm spending a lot of time exploring a lot of different really cool opportunities that are out there for me to consider, which may not have been if I hadn't done what I just did.
In my family, your glasses have become legendary. So I was dared by my 5 older siblings to ask you if I could
5 older siblings?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
3 sisters, 2 brothers. They dared me to ask you if I could try them on.
Yeah, sure. Here you go.
All right.
It's they're Warby Parker frames. Good company.
Well, Jay Carney, thanks so much for joining us.
All right, Cody. Thank you. It's a pleasure. I hope you can see okay.
As always, wherever the camera is, thank you for joining us. This has been YTV. Everybody has a story. I'm Cody Pomerantz. See you next time.